The tractor, clearance lights, and marker lights. Make sure they are properly mounted, not cracked or broken, clean, and amber in color. After that, check the headlights, turn signals, and four-ways. Make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken. The turn signals are amber in color, headlights are clear in color. From there, I'll check the fender mirrors. Make sure they are properly mounted, not cracked or broken. I'll check for leaks. Make sure there's no leaks from transmission or engine and no puddles on the ground. Look at the truck for any leans. That would indicate a flat tire or a suspension problem. Now, I'll check the license plate. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, with current registration. Now that I know that everything is safe in the front of the tractor, let's move on to the passenger side. Let's open the hood and inspect all the components to make sure they're safe. Follow me. I'll start with the alternator. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and the belts are not ripped, torn, or cut, and have no more than 3/4 of an inch of free play at the center. I'll check the alternator wires. Make sure they're not ripped, torn, or cut. I'll check all the belts on this side. Make sure they're not ripped, torn, or cut, and have no more than 3/4 of an inch of free play at the center. Check all hoses on this side. Make sure they're not ripped, torn, or cut, or leaking, and they are clamped at both ends. From there, I'll check the windshield washer reservoir to make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, or leaking, and that it's filled to the proper level. Now, under the hood on the driver's side. Check the oil fill cap to make sure it's secured. I'll check the oil dipstick to verify the oil is at the proper level. With the engine off, I'll pull the dipstick out, wipe it off, reinsert it, pull it back out, and check that the level is above the refill mark. Now, I'll check the air compressor, which is gear driven. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking. I'll check the compressor hoses. Make sure they're not ripped, torn, or cut, or leaking, and they are clamped at both ends. Now, I'll check the water pump, which is belt driven. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking, and the belts are not ripped, torn, or cut, and have no more than 3/4 of an inch of free play at the center. Now, I would like to check my two reservoirs, my power steering reservoir and my coolant reservoir. Make sure they are both properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking, and they are both filled to the proper level. Now, I'll check the power steering pump, which is gear driven, to make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking. From there, I'll check the steering shaft. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or bent. That leads me to the gearbox. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking, and I'll check the gearbox hoses the same as all the other hoses. Now, I'll check my steering linkage, which consists of my pitman arm, my drag link, my upper and lower steering arms, and my tie rods. All of those components should be properly mounted, not cracked or broken or bent, and it should all be secured with nuts, bolts, and cotter pins. I'll start my first axle, my steering axle. I'll check the leaf springs to make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken or shifted. I'll check the leaf spring hangers and U-bolts to make sure they are properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and I'll check the bushings to make sure they're not missing or dry rotted. From there, I'll check the shock absorber to make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking. Now, I'll check the brake hose. Make sure it's not ripped, torn, or cut, or leaking any air. From there, I'll check the brake chamber. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking. That leads me to the slack adjuster, push rod, and cotter pin. Make sure they're all properly mounted, not cracked or broken. There should be no more than 1 inch of play when the brakes are released. After that, I'll check the brake drum to make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or warped. Also, make sure it's free of grease and free of debris. I'll check the brake pads. Make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and have at least 1/4 inch of material remaining. Now for the tires, I'll check the inner and outer wall for any cuts, bubbles, or rips. I'll check the overall condition of the tire to make sure it has even tread wear. I'll check the tire tread depth to make sure it's at least 4/32 of an inch remaining, and I'll check the PSI in the tire to make sure it's at least 110 PSI. I would check that with an air pressure gauge. Also, I would like to check the metal valve stem with the metal cap. Now, I'll check the rim for any cracks or illegal welds. After that, I'll check all of the lug nuts to make sure they are all present and secured. not cracked, and no signs of rust to indicate looseness or no shiny threads to indicate stripping. After that, I'll check the hub oil seal to make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking. And if it had a clear sight glass, I would make sure that it was filled to the proper level. Now, I'll move over to the driver's side of the tractor. Now that we finished inspecting our first axle, or our steering axle, we can keep moving on the side of the tractor and keep inspecting every component that we see. I'll start with the mirror, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken. From there, I'll check the door, make sure it opens and closes properly. I'll check the handle and hinges to make sure they're all properly mounted, not cracked or broken. After that, I'll check the weather stripping to make sure it's not missing or dry rotted. From there, I'll move on to the battery box, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and there's no signs of corrosion. Next, I'll check the steps, make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken, they are free of debris, and they are able to support my weight. Now, I'll check the batteries to make sure they're properly mounted, no leaks, and no signs of corrosion. After that, I'll check the fuel tank bands to make sure they're securely holding the tank. I'll check the rubber straps, make sure they're not ripped, torn, or cut. After that, I'll check the fuel tank, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking. Make sure the fuel cap is secured, tight, and not leaking. I'll check the fuel hose and the electric wire to make sure they're not ripped, torn, or cut, or leaking. Now, I'll check the marker light, left turn signal, and four-way flasher. I'll check that light the same way as the previous lights. This is amber in color. Now, I'm in between the tractor and trailer. I'll start with the catwalk and steps. Make sure they are properly mounted, not cracked or broken, free of debris, and they can support my weight. From there, I'll check the frame and cross members. Make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and no illegal welds or excessive drill holes. Now, I'll check the drive shaft and U-joints. Make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken or bent, and the U-joints are free of debris. After that, I'll check the splash guard. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and is high enough to catch any debris. From there, I'll check the header board. Make sure there's no holes or visible damage. Also, make sure it can support the weight of the load. I'll check the 5 clearance lights the same way I checked my previous lights. These are amber in color. Now, I'll check the glad hands. Make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking, and the rubber grommet is not missing or dry rotted. After that, I'll check the emergency line, which is the red line. Make sure it's not ripped, torn, or cut or leaking, and it's properly connected from the tractor to the trailer. Next, I'll check the service line, which is the blue line. Make sure it's not ripped, torn, or cut or leaking, and it's properly connected from the tractor to the trailer. From here, I'll check the electric line. Make sure it's not ripped, torn, or cut, and it's properly connected from the tractor to the trailer. Now, we will inspect our second and third axle, which is our drive axles. A lot of the components we're going to see here, we already saw on axle 1. They are very similar. Let's jump into it. For these axles, I would check the leaf springs, the leaf spring hangers, the U-bolts, the bushings, the shock absorber, the brake hose, the brake chamber, the slack adjuster, push rod, and cotter pin, the brake drum, the brake pads, also the inner and outer wall of the tires, the overall condition of the tires, the metal valve stem with a metal cap, the rims, and the lug nuts. I will check all of these components just like I did on axle 1. There is no difference between them. However, I do have 6 new components in my drive axles. I'll start with the torsion bar. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or bent. From there, I'll check the airbags. Make sure they're properly mounted, not ripped, torn, or cut or leaking. After that, I'll check the butt spacer. Make sure it's properly mounted, not rusted through, it's free of debris, and the tires are not touching each other. Now, I'll check the tire tread depth. Should be at least 2/32 of an inch remaining. After that, I'll check the PSI in the tire. Should be at least 95 PSI. I would check that with an air pressure gauge. Now, I'll check the axle seal to make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking, and all the bolts are present and secured. Moving on to the fifth wheel, I'll start with the platform. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and has no illegal welds. I'll check all the mounting bolts, make sure they're all present and secured. I'll check the fifth wheel slide, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and ensure that the locking pins go all the way through the holes and are fully engaged. After that, I'll check the release handle, make sure it's pushed in a locked in safety position. Now, I'll check the skid plate, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and properly greased. From there, I'll check the apron of the trailer, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken. There should be no spacing or gap between the fifth wheel skid plate and the apron of the trailer. Before I hook up my tractor to my trailer, I check the kingpin to make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or bent. Now, I'll check the locking jaws, make sure they are locked around the shank of the kingpin. Also, I would like to check the fifth wheel position, make sure it's positioned properly so the tractor frame will clear the landing gear. Now, let's check the second half of our combination vehicle, which is our trailer. Let's start with the side and work our way down the rear of the trailer. Let's check the tail lights, turn signals, and four-way flashers, the same way we checked the previous lights. These are red in color. After that, I'll check the reflector lights, make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken. From there, I'll check the mud flaps, make sure they're properly mounted, not ripped, torn, or cut, or missing, and are low enough to catch any debris. Now that I'm here, I'll check the floor and cross members. Make sure the floors are not damaged and the cross members of the trailer go all the way across and are not damaged. Now, I would like to check the landing gear. Make sure it's properly mounted, not damaged, it's fully raised, and the handle is secured and there's no debris on the boots. Now, I'll check the overall condition of the trailer, make sure there's no visible damage or excessive holes. After that, I'll check the DOT reflective tape, make sure it's clean, visible, and it covers at least 80% of the side of the trailer. I'll check the four-way flasher and turn signal the same way I checked my previous lights. These are amber in color. After that, I'll check the market light. The same way I checked my previous lights, this is amber in color. From there, I'll check the ABS light. The same way I checked my previous light, this is also amber in color. After that, I'll check the other market light. The same way as my previous lights, this is red in color. Now, I would like to check the air lines. Make sure they're not ripped, torn, or cut, or leaking, and they are at least 18 inches above the ground. Now that I'm here, I'll check the tandem release button, make sure it's in a locked position, and both of the pins are fully engaged through the hole of the tandem slide. Now, I'll check the tandem slide, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken. Let's inspect our fourth and fifth axle, or our trailer axles. They are very similar to our previous axles. Let's go. I'll check the shock absorber, the airbags, the brake hose, the brake chamber, slack adjuster, push rod, and cotter pin, the brake drums, the brake pads, also the butt spacer, the inner and outer wall of the tires, the overall condition of the tires, the metal stem valve with the metal cap, the tire tread depth, and the PSI. After that, I'll check the rims and all the lug nuts. I will check all of these components just like I did on axle 2 and 3. There is no difference between them. However, I do have two new components on my trailer axles, and they are the torque arm, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or bent, and the bushings are not missing or dry rotted. After that, I'll check the hub oil seal, make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking, and if it had a clear sight glass, I would make sure that it was filled to the proper level. Now, I'll check the remainder of the trailer. The mud flaps must be properly mounted, not ripped, torn, cut, or missing, and they should be low enough to catch any debris. I'll check the door tie bag to make sure it's properly mounted and not missing. We're almost finished with our pre-trip inspection. Let's move on to the rear of the trailer and finish inspecting the few components that we have left. In the rear of the trailer, I would check the 5 clearance lights the same way I checked my previous lights. These are red in color. I'll check the door to make sure it opens and closes properly. From there, I'll check the handle, hinges, and door ties. Make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken or missing. After that, I'll check the weather stripping on the trailer door. Make sure it's not missing, ripped, torn, cut, or dry rotted. From there, I'll check the tail lights, the left turn signal, the right turn signal, and the 4-way flashers the same way I checked the previous lights. These are red in color. Next, I would like to check the DOT bar. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and it's at least 18 inches from the ground, and the DOT reflective tape covers 100% of it. I would like to check the license plate. Make sure it's properly mounted, not cracked or broken, with current registration. Now, I will check the right side of the tractor and trailer the same way I did on the left side. There is only one difference. That difference is the exhaust with the proper heat shield. Make sure they are properly mounted, not cracked or broken or leaking. Black soot is a sign of leaking. To start my air brake test, first I will get in the vehicle using 3 points of contact. After that, I will put on my safety belt. Make sure it's not ripped, torn, or cut. Make sure it latches and unlatches properly. Now, I would like to safe start my vehicle. To safe start my vehicle, I would press the clutch, check that my vehicle is in neutral, check that both of my valves are out. Now I can safe start my vehicle. Now after my vehicle started, my ABS light came on for 3 to 5 seconds and then it shut off, letting me know that it's working properly. Now, I would like to build up my air pressure to the proper operating range, which is between 120 psi and 140 psi. At that time, my governor will kick out, letting me know that my pressure has been regulated. You may assist at this time. And that was the governor kicking out, letting me know that my pressure has been regulated. Now, I would like to secure my vehicle by putting it into first gear. Clutch in. Now that my vehicle is secured into first gear, I would like to shut off my engine and turn on my instrument panel. I look for my gauges to sweep. Now I can start checking for leaks. To check for leaks, I would release both of my brakes. Now, I will press my service brake for 1 minute. In that 1 minute, I should lose no more than 3 psi for a straight truck and 4 psi for a combination vehicle. This is a combination vehicle. And I'll start my time now. After that minute is up, and I didn't lose more than 4 psi in my combination vehicle, I will start fanning down the brakes. Before 55 psi, my low air warning light and buzzer will come on. Now that this happened, I will continue to fan down my brakes, and when my PSI reaches between 45 PSI and 20 PSI, both of my valves will pop out. Now that both of my valves popped out, I would like to perform another safe start. Again, clutch in, put the vehicle back into neutral, and check that my valves are completely out. And safe start my vehicle. Now that my air pressure is starting to build up, what's going to happen is this. Between 55 and 70 psi, my low air warning light and buzzer will cancel. Unassisted, it should take no more than 45 seconds to go from 85 psi to 100 psi. After that, it will continue to rise to the proper operating range, which is between 120 psi and 140 psi. Again, at that point, my governor will kick out, letting me know that my pressure has been regulated. While I wait for all of this to happen, I would like to start my in-cab inspection. For my in-cab inspection, I would like to check my fire extinguisher to make sure it's properly mounted, properly rated, it's fully charged, and it has a safety pin in it. After that, I'll check my 3 reflective triangles in the back. I'll also check for spare fuses in the glove box. From there, I'll move on to checking all of my mirrors to make sure they are all adjusted to me. I'll check my windshield to make sure it has no cracks or illegal stickers. I'll check the dashboard to make sure it's free of debris. I'll check the steering wheel to make sure it has no more than 2 inches of free play. And I'll check the clutch to make sure it has no less than 2 inches of free play. Now, I would like to check all of my gauges, starting with my oil pressure gauge to make sure it's around 40 psi. I'll check my water temperature gauge to make sure it's rising properly. I'll check my fuel gauge to make sure I have at least 1/2 of a tank, or at least enough fuel for this trip. Now, I'll check the DEF gauge to make sure I have at least 1/8 or enough for this trip. I'll check my primary and secondary air pressure gauges to make sure they are rising to the proper operating range. Also, I would like to check my voltmeter to make sure it's reading between 12 and 14 volts, letting me know that my alternator is charging my batteries properly. Now, I would like to check my indicator lights. So I'll turn on my headlights. Now, I would like to check my left turn signal indicator, check my right turn signal indicator, check my high beam indicator, and check my 4-way indicators. Now I can shut those off. And I would like to check my windshield wipers to make sure they're properly mounted, not cracked or broken, and the wiper blade has enough tension against the glass to catch any debris. I also want to make sure that the windshield washer fluid is spraying properly. After that, I would like to check that the fans on my defrosters are working properly, make sure it's blowing hot and cold, and make sure that my fans for my vents are also blowing hot and cold. After that, I would like to check my city horn and my air horn. Now, I would like to do a tuck test. To do a tuck test, first, I would put my vehicle into first gear, clutch in, first gear. First, I would like to test my parking brakes by releasing my trailer brakes. Now, I would release the clutch slowly. I would feel a slight tug, but my vehicle should not move. There. Now, I would like to check my trailer brakes by releasing my parking brakes. Again, I would feel a slight tug, but my vehicle should not move. There. Now, I will release both of my brakes and do an alignment check. For my alignment check, I will move up about 10 feet, holding my steering wheel lightly at 8 and 4. Then I will push in the clutch, then my service brake, and my vehicle should not move to the left or the right. Secure my vehicle again. And that concludes my air brake test, in-cab inspection, tuck test, and alignment test.